Hello, friends. This is the AlphaList podcast. I am your host, Toby. The goal of the AlphaList podcast is to empower CTOs with the info and insight they need to make the best decisions for the company. We do this by hosting top thought leaders and picking their brains for insights into technical leadership and tech trends. If you believe in the power of accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth, make sure to subscribe to this podcast. Plus, if you're an experienced CTO, you will love the discussion happening in our Slack space where over 600 CTOs are sharing insights, or visit one of our events. Just go to alphalist.com to apply. Welcome to the AlphaList podcast. I'm your host, Toby. And the question for today is, how well prepared are you? And my guest today is Tim Armandpour, CTO of PagerDuty, a software we all know. And Tim, is like your mission basically is maximizing user value, right? Like in a nutshell, I mean, people just think of like monitoring of like, I don't know, red and green light that turns on and annoys your bastard operator from hell to death, but it's not. Your mission is to maximize user value because it's all about users, right? And like uptime ultimately is about users. Before you joined PagerDuty, you led global engineering teams at PayPal. Prior to that, I think your company was acquired by PayPal. You were vice president of engineering at a company called Zong. And you're in the game since the late 90s.
Yeah, 98, 99.
99. So welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Toby. It's fun to be here. Appreciate it.
So let's basically start with your early days before we start with like the bugging questions of how well prepared people are. And let's start with your early career and your, let's say, nerd journey. Like, why did you ultimately become a nerd or a geek, like however you want to call it these days? I think nerds are cool. Like 10 years ago, they were not. So I leave it open to my guests. Where did you start and why?
Yeah, I've always felt we're super cool as nerds and geeks and what have you. I think nerd journey for me started young, playing video games, and then being enamored with I think it was the first program environment was with a thing called Logo on the Apple IIc, where you would tell a little triangle and you give it a grid and tell it which way to go and how many, clicks to go up, down, left, right, and learn how to do loops and whatnot. And really took off from there. I think in my high school years, I really got into OpenGL programming. And I had this vision of becoming like a video game programmer at some point and building video games, since that was a big part of my life along with sports. And then, in college at UC San Diego, fell into computer science and went from there. Fortunate enough to be doing work for a particular professor at university, and that professor became a co-founder of a company called Yodlee. So right after college, drove up from San Diego up to the Bay Area in San Francisco, and that was call it early part of 1999, and was the first engineer on the ground, one of the first engineers on the ground at Yodlee. And we had this vision of really helping people make better decisions with information. The information at hand was their financial information. So being able to aggregate all their financial data into one place so you didn't have to go to 30 different websites. And people back then were still apprehensive of putting their banking data online, looking at their credit cards online. Now it's second nature to do on your mobile phone as your roaming provider there. But that's where I was an engineer, writing a lot of code as fast as we could. Felt like a rat race. And then probably about 6-7 years into that, fell into a leadership role, leading a team from a technical perspective, not necessarily managing the people, but really helping to guide and direct the work, and fell in love with the advent of, having a leadership role, and opportunity came to then start leading people and teams, and you start to grow and build from there over the years. But predominantly I had joined companies pretty early stage as an individual contributor with the eye towards helping to grow the company and the teams in that regard. how I landed at PagerDuty. I was very happy in my prior post, and I was a happy customer and end user of PagerDuty. I saw the difference PagerDuty makes for teams, and really helping teams just operate at a higher level. And it was took the recruiter call, fell in love with the founders and their dream, which was really around how to elevate the developer experience to first class status, much like what like GitHub has done for software development, what Jira has done for even like tracking work to a large extent. And PagerDuty's been very much squarely focused on not just the end user value component, but really what transpires to help realize value. And a lot of things that we see out in the wild, organizations and companies struggle with what do you do when you're interrupted and the work to be done is really, really time critical, right? The pressure kicks in, the heart starts beating faster, you process information different as a human. How can we help you do that job better at scale of any kind, right? And here we are, the company's been around almost 16 years, 25,000 plus organizations globally leverage us and depend on us. And, we take a lot of pride in helping to put that positive dent in the universe.
I'm actually curious what happened in your HQ back in the days. I think it was in July, right?
July 19th. It's really interesting with how we get plugged in and kind of the scale that we operate at. We end up starting to see signals emerge quite early in the grand scheme of things. So I think Australia was the first major continent that started to get demonstrate some impact. And so that would have been somewhere around, I think, between 3 and 4 a.m. Pacific time on the west coast of the United States here. And we started to see, a lot of monitoring events coming to us from customers in Australia. And then that started to then, manifest almost like a rolling thunder that would develop in a storm coming in. And within a few hours, we definitely took an increased and sustained amount of load on our systems. And one of the things we're super proud about is, though a lot of the world as we know it was impacted in one form or another, but we, our platform and services were able to withstand the event storm. I think we sustained something like 250% average increase of overall volume of inbound traffic to us. And we were able to adhere to all of our SLAs, continue to exceed them, and kind of keep our brand promise to our customers, which is, we got to be at our best when everyone else may not be. And that resulted in us being able to do our job, which is to help, be in a way eyes and ears for a lot of customers that rely on, digital systems to run their businesses. And so, I think we played a part in helping organizations react and respond, and ultimately, ideally, like mitigate whatever was happening in their world at that time.
So did you ultimately kill the Slack API at that day because you had to notify so many people at the same time?
It's not, we have Slack, Microsoft Teams, WhatsApp, SMS globally, voice, push notifications, everything was humming at a pretty hefty clip with some sustained load. And, we have this other part of our performance SLA that'll say, within 5 minutes of triggering the event, we will get that notification out to any user anywhere on the planet. And we stayed well within our performance SLA bounds, which is also, fun to see in the grand scheme of things. A lot of hard work up front goes into preparing for things like that, but it was great to see us be able to, withstand the pressure in that regard. And again, kind of do what we need to do, which is to be there for our customers.
I'm not sure if there was an official post-mortem back in the days that was public or something, but maybe like looking at that incident, which had a big effect, let's say. What is your recommendation for companies, for startups to be well prepared? Because honest answer for most, if you ask most CTOs, how well prepared are you? Is not really, right?
They just don't know. They don't know.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times in the industry, Toby, it's you don't know what you don't know until it's kind of too late.
Yeah.
And sometimes for these scenarios, as leaders, too often we don't lean in early enough until something's really broken, right? And current times, like, I mean, the way the digital world works, where it's zero tolerance for anything not happening fast on my phone or transacting right away, we don't have enough of that luxury anymore. And so, it's when you think about like early stage companies all the way to very, very well established brands that are large companies on the planet here, I think there's a natural balancing act to strike, and you have to balance between what you're optimizing for and what's in the best interest of your business and where you can hedge. Because it is a game of learning how to hedge, right? Because you can't solve all the things. And you think about the risk posture overall. So you take a severity of a thing, maybe an event or a certain situation, the likelihood of that happening, and that's going to declare, how risky is it? And I don't think there's enough of that hard work up front to start to itemize those scenarios enough. And at the bare minimum, I think, especially like technology leaders, that should be on your agenda. You should be able to pinpoint and understand how well prepared are you in the event of which way you classify severity of scenarios, right? Whether it's severity 0 being all hands on deck, severity 1, 2, 3, etc. You should have a handle on what that means for you, what you do when you detect something, what you do when you have to go and act on it. Like, what do your resolution paths look like? How do you learn from it? But it's the work that you do that doesn't show up, let's say, in the product experience to almost like the untrained eye, so to speak. When you can mask enough of the failure scenarios and mitigate quickly, that raises that resiliency stance, that ideally your users rarely notice something went a little bit sideways. Because in current world distributed systems, what's the old saying? Everything's in a constant state of failure. It's just what kind of failure is happening. How, again, when you can detect it, how well are you ready to flex that muscle? And most companies just aren't well prepared enough. We saw it happen July 19th. Like, part of the world is very brittle when it comes to digital operations. And that can take on different definition based on context. But, I was traveling that day. It was interesting. I was in the San Jose airport in California, picking up my son from a summer camp. And we were traveling back that Friday. You walk through the airport, and on the big screens, big blue screens of death, right? You're like, oh, well, okay. All right. So, that's not working. This isn't working.
Nice.
Luckily, we were flying on an airline that wasn't impacted. So I don't know if that was a good thing or bad thing, but we got home on time and everything. But literally everywhere you looked was blue screen.
Okay. So people weren't really well prepared. So let's look at how people can prepare better. So basically, what you recommend is like to write down the potential failure vectors and weight them, right? And then maybe like develop a strategy for the most important ones, or basically even for every one of them, instead of, I don't know, having, I think disaster recovery plan then basically tackles each of the individual items, right? What else do you recommend? Like what else can companies do?
So there's, I think, having a point of view on what's your disaster recovery plan and approach is pretty. You need to have one, right? And again, depending on what stage of maturity you're at with the company, that's going to naturally evolve. But once you start to itemize what are these failure scenarios I need to be aware of and understand really well, you got to practice it. It's like, it's like physical fitness. You have a goal, which is to, I don't know whether it's, your body weight, your body composition, your blood panel, whatever that's going to take, whatever it might be from a fitness perspective. You're not going to get there by accident. You have to have intent and purpose, and you have to go to the gym. You got to go for walks. You got to get on a bike, whatever it might be. And you have to be able to sustain it on a regular basis. The one thing we've learned the most inside the walls of PagerDuty is, we don't have every failure scenario figured out. whoever tells you that is pretty much lying, right? But what we do pride ourselves on a lot is that we invest in the practice of, how fast do we detect a thing? How fast can we triage or analyze and pinpoint what might be going on, then respond, then remediate, then learn from it. We run controlled failures in our production environments pretty much all the time. We started, call it 10 plus years back with a series that we call Failure Fridays. People can look up PagerDuty Failure Fridays. And it was a process and a mechanism to help us all practice, one, responding, learning how to debug. And that's another lost art that we'd probably spend hours talking about. And really as a team, as a working group, start to learn like what works, what doesn't work. What do I need to prepare for as an individual, let alone my team? Where does the knowledge for these things sit? Is it centralized and curated and accessible by all, or is it sitting in someone's head, right? You uncover a lot of these different kind of intangibles that show up in the natural course of response that you want to start to codify and get better and more consistent and predictable about, ideally, right? But you got to invest in. So we take time out of developing new features to practice these Failure Friday, almost like game day like scenarios. And now we've graduated to a point of maturity where teams can run what they call failure any days. Like any team can just go ahead, inject failure to their given maybe service footprint or what have you, and do it in a controlled manner where our customers basically never notice.
So basically a human chaos monkey then.
Well, there's human chaos. It's a combination of human with the process and the practice of incident response. There's also systems and code that aids in that from a tooling perspective. The simian army that was created by Netflix, we became big fans of early on in the open source side of how to inject chaos and failure in a controlled manner from a very programmatic perspective. And it's things like inject jitter in the network. So make the network a little bit less reliable. What happens to your distributed system? What kind of assumptions did you have in place that assumed kind of like perfect input into a program, let alone perfect network conditions, across things you don't control, like the internet backbone, or across cloud providers, or across availability zones, what have you. So a lot of those things play in. You start to then mature up. We've actually written quite a bit on this as a practice and open sourced it in our what we call our ops guides. And a lot of that was based on the back of, almost 15 years of experience of really, really internally focusing on developing almost a fairly robust approach to understanding your response capabilities. And again, it's like, you don't want it to atrophy. So you got to work it out, and you have to, it's not one and done on an annualized basis to meet the compliance need. It's about making it part of almost like core culture and prioritizing it.
Understood. And how deeply does that tie into your architectural patterns of your infrastructure typically? Like where do you start there, and what are your recommendations for like choosing a resilient infrastructure these days?
Yeah, it's getting more challenging because more and more of us depend on things we have no control over, right? Like there's the magic of the cloud providers. So purposely, as a customer of a major cloud provider, we outsource a lot to them, and that creates a leverage point for us, so we can go focus on things that I really have maybe no interest whatsoever in managing, like swapping out physical disks, right? Dealing with power distribution units inside a data center, things like that. When it comes to the notion of resiliency, I think you do want to adopt certain patterns in play in order to, and again, it's going to be somewhat dependent, but if you think about inside a major cloud provider, right, and you understand the physical topology that a cloud provider takes on, for example, you have the availability zone, and you have multiple availability zones within a region. A region is a collection of buildings in a certain geographic area. So how do you want to withstand potential issues from, let's say, one part of a building to another, or one building to another, so to speak, and or that entire region? understanding, distributed systems and how the notion of, network plays such a huge role in that, and the types of assumptions you put in. The CAP theorem comes in a lot. If you want to be bold enough and ambitious enough to bend the rules and or the pieces that are part of the CAP theorem, I kind of wish you well. We've learned the hard way that it doesn't exactly work. And we had to undo quite a few things over the years. But, the resiliency posture also comes again with like the practice. So, I think the market resiliency is really around how well and fast do you recover without anybody noticing? And, assuming constant state of failure in a lot of places, how well tuned is your monitoring to understand that you detected something before maybe your customer or your internal end users did, what have you, right? How well prepared are you to react to that and understand, the tools at hand, the context, where to look, who else to bring in, so on and so forth, in order to minimize that time in the let me figure it out stage. Because that's where most companies actually lose a lot of time without really knowing it, is in that triage analysis phase. It's kind of like a patient walking into an emergency room in a trauma center, and the doctor and the staff don't have a lot of information other than the patient looks like they're bleeding. Where are they bleeding from? What caused it? Where else it's happening? The ability for that doctor and crew to accurately and quickly triage is going to determine more or less what the outcome of that patient's most likely going to be, whether it's a positive outcome or slightly less positive in a pretty quick time frame. So, teams have to practice these scenarios. Otherwise, doing it when it really matters for the first time, you're not gonna. It's maybe with luck you get by, but it's probably not gonna result very positively for the business at large.
And generally, like maybe starting once more with infrastructure, like any things you would recommend having or avoiding these days? Like, I don't know, choose simplicity, like go for 12 factor apps, use Kubernetes, have ephemeral infrastructure in a way, self-healing systems. I guess that's all meaningful, but
they're so that you think of like from a software perspective, then underlying that you got like a systems perspective that comes into play. There's certain choice points. I am a big believer, and I've learned that the more you can standardize, the better chance you give yourself, even though it could be very very inviting to try the latest greatest thing that someone maybe blogged about or showed up in another outlet or resource. But I do like things that are a little more tried and true and proven in the grand scheme of things. Again, just through years of not getting it right or being part of teams that didn't get it right. I think again to simplify and clarify as like an ongoing scenario is kind of one of those things that it's not easy to do as a technologist, especially in the software system space, because there are a lot of moving parts, a lot of dependencies you may not understand. And, with the advent of, let's say, the pattern around microservices over the last, call it, decade and a half or so, one of those scenarios that we often see is something might start as a microservice, which means it's going to do more or less a singular function really, really, really well. And it's going to be heavily constrained, right, by design. It then gets a little more functionality injected into it, and you then rev it again and again. Before you know it, you got like a monolithic structure. When you really zoom in and say, oh, it's not a microservice anymore. And then that starts to now multiply across your environment. I think there's room for monoliths and microservices. There's pros and cons to each, and a lot of it is, again, dependent on context. What you do want to be able to, I think, strive for is an approach to standardizing parts of patterns, especially around like transaction management. Data is typically the Achilles heel, how you approach managing it, whether it's the storage engines you choose, or you go full polyglot and have one of everything for different functions. We often find ourselves chasing our tails with respect to data, especially at scale factors, right? And being able to, recover from, we have recovery point objectives, recovery time objectives, things like that. Depending on how you've approached your own data architecture can be a make or break point. So there's a lot probably to unpack there, but I do think, the tried and true things do tend to do well. If you've got the staffing that can lean in, there's still a lot of value in open source. And I do think if you are going to venture into open source, the key thing to strive for as a leader and within your teams is how to approach things as a mechanic and not just a driver, right? Understanding how things work under the hood go a long way to inform your next set of decision points. And those choice points formulate your overall strategy, but you learn a lot along the way. And I think there's a lot of value in taking a peek under the hood and understanding how something works before you go too deep into it.
Thank you. Talking of like digging deeper under the hood, and you having to operate a very resilient infrastructure that has to scale globally. How many nines do you provide to your customers? What is your promise?
Yeah, so we average right around 4 nines of availability. We promise on paper 3 nines, so we give us that 10x error budget. Some parts of our infrastructure is at 5 nines, based on how we measure. Ultimately, we want to strive for always being there when our customers absolutely need us, right? So, and again, those things don't come by. You have to invest and put time and effort into crafting your path to achieve, n number of nines. At some point, like the math becomes almost like diminishing returns beyond 4 or 5 nines, kind of like, okay, really? But that's kind of our internal target is 4 nines at all times.
And then coming back to digging under the hood, I guess the platforms and clouds you operate on have less nines than you have, right? And then you promise your clients most likely, how do you deal with that? How does it work?
This is where there's a little more art than pure science involved, where you think about to your point, many of the cloud providers for underlying infrastructure you're going to rely on promise you 3 nines, right? And so we took the approach, well, we must provide a higher degree of availability for our customers for the profile that our platform takes on in the wild. And this is where, again, understanding the failure scenarios that do exist, that might exist, right? And putting the time into crafting strategies around how you mask those failure scenarios as best you can. I'd say a pretty large portion of our time gets spent discussing and or strategizing and implementing ways in which we look to mask specific types of failure scenarios such that our customers never notice. And again, it goes back to the beginning part of the loop around doing some of that hard work up front, identification, the design to it, and really being convicted about the approach to preparedness comes full circle, right? Because there are some choice points we make along the way and they come back and bite us, but ideally because I think we are best in class when it comes to being prepared for how to react, how to resolve, how to learn from that. Our customers rarely notice in the grand scheme of things. And it's not going to be the same thing for all the things. Like parts of a user experience will have a certain types of failure zones that are acceptable, and you can roll with those. There are parts of the system though that absolutely cannot, right? And so again, your approach is going to vary, but still having an eye towards understanding what those are. That's again that be the mechanic, not just the driver, even with the magic of the cloud and all the magic that it offers us.
Cool. What do people often do wrong when defining criteria? When defining their SLIs? I see many companies, or I think that many people end up tracking vanity metrics in a way and chasing vanity metrics. like what do you think is like a meaningful SLI? And how do you define that? Like apart from like typical uptime, right? Like how do you avoid chasing something that isn't meaningful?
I think a lot of times what many might overlook is kind of the relationship to the business context, right? And it's like a common pitfall, I think, where the metrics that teams might decide on and declare don't have a tie into types of business outcomes, right? And that can show up in a variety of ways. I think, when you think about how you're defining what your success criteria is, it could be a given user flow. It could be a given certain transaction flow without user experience being involved, but ultimately might manifest that way. But I do think understanding success criteria and then starting to interpolate, well, what are the edge cases that I really need to care about, and what are the ones I don't care about? Because if it's from a purely technical perspective, odds are you're going to miss components that would comprise a given SLI that really, really matter, right? Because it's like almost like a cascade down and a kind of build up of depending on where things are in the system. And you do want to layer these types of contracts, if you will, and these definitions, so that then when you get into defining what's your actual SLO, your service level objective involved there, again, it should be logical and reasonable and measurable and detectable, right? But I do think one of the pitfalls sits around like how well do these metrics actually align to the needs of the business versus vanity? Because otherwise, as engineers, we can go on optimizing forever. And at some point, hypothetically, you're going to have enough nines, diminishing returns. That's bad investment. Move on.
How do you then, like, let's say you sat down, you defined your SLIs, you up and running for a while, optimized and shaped your setup. Like, how do you assess your team's incident readiness? Like, what's like through like not only practicing, like if you want to just assess it, like if you're maybe new to the team and you want to figure out like, hey, how well prepared are we? Like, and not only like read the docs that people came up with, but just want to assess it in a hard way. Like, what should you do?
It's a good question. I think if you think about where things tend to start, usually it comes down to like the source of the information that's helping you understand whether or not there's an acceptable heartbeat. So in this world, it'd be monitoring in the world of observability. How well vetted and tuned are the signals coming in to help me understand not just is something with blinking lights still have the lights blinking, right? If we layer up a little bit, but is the functionality working as we expect it to, right? And the how you craft and design your monitoring to be able to detect and surface the anomalous scenarios, because that's where then it should kind of pretty much grab your attention. Something goes, a certain bit maybe above a certain standard deviation from the mean and what you typically expect, and you understand seasonality, or maybe you don't have seasonality. That's usually a natural starting point to say, do we even know how to know that this thing is green, yellow, or red? This thing being like the service or collection services or parts of the environment. That's usually where like the biggest smell factor sits. And in today's world, especially with like organizations that have been around, they might go to their observability platform of choice and see nothing but dashboards everywhere. And ideally, again, this gets into like, parts of think about ownership of the software you produce, ownership of the systems you manage, etc. It's more than just the code base at the end of the day. Like it's the things that surround the code base that help you understand whether or not what you've developed, what you've deployed, how you've deployed it, how you're operating it is actually at the acceptable clip of what you expect from the experience, from the product, from the platform, all the way tied to the business. But the detection side is usually the place where you end up either asking the most questions or you get the most questions answered pretty quickly.
Would you say that the neglection of the idea of you build it, you ship it, you run it is the Achilles heel of most observability or most companies these days and most dev teams these days still?
I think it varies at certain scale factors. So I think of it in terms of when we think about the notion of DevOps and it coming to the rise, say, I don't know, 15, maybe 18 years back. Can't remember what the right timeline is, but let's say for a while, as it was picking up steam, kind of like my personal take on it and my perspective had a lot to do with it's a mindset that you get into. And then you accept that the fact that I'm going to accept accountability for what I'm building and deploying. Now I need some help to understand whether or not it's doing well, how to deploy well, what that kind of environment looks like and when it's in tip-top shape. And that's where we start to see specialization start to show up in the industry. But still, it was about enabling and empowering those that are developing the things to own the things once it's out in the wild versus like a handoff scenario and having multiple layers of indirection kick in when needing to figure out what do I do when the unexpected happens at the end of the day. I think when you get to certain like hyperscale type of scale, so pick one of your hyperscalers, how they operate across all the multitude of businesses they have, most likely they will never standardize on like some kind of stringent pure DevOps way of doing a thing because it's just too hard. There's so many challenges with it doing it at a certain scale factor, but it does mean you can't abide by some of the principles that help govern like what does ownership look like. At the end of the day, like as an org, you should define what ownership means for you. And I don't think that's up for negotiation. And maybe that varies by business unit or by area, but you write it down, you adhere to it, you build tooling to facilitate it, you build process and practice to manage it well, and then you then have the right types of KPIs and measures to understand, are you operating at the acceptable, clip for the business? But you do need to define what ownership exactly is, because when you leave it ambiguous, when something hits the fan, guess what? Everyone's getting on a call and someone's asking one, hey, what's changed in the last however much time? And it goes silent for a while. Who owns that? It goes silent. You got to go find somebody or some group that owns it. Well, what do we do now? Right? These are the things that drive leaders absolutely bonkers when you're on these big, big calls and you have hundreds of people wasting time and money and effort in order to just get the basics in place. And that's part of it. That's what led rise to a lot of how we've approached these different types of problem spaces, helping us solve for ourselves and our customers so that ideally you're not left asking these rote questions across hundreds of people. You shouldn't have to. We are better than that. But it does take the lean in the grand scheme of things from an organization to govern itself in that regard. But too often people don't write down what does ownership mean. It usually starts from
Yeah. That's the first thing to do in many companies, right? Like I don't know. There's so many tools floating around. Also with SaaS being around, like components where you never agree on a concrete ownership, or like a business owner and a technical owner, and that really can bring you into trouble. Right?
That's it's actually a really good point, Toby, around when parts of the technology stack is owned by the technology teams. Technology teams don't make decisions in a vacuum. Ideally, they're closely linked to achieving the most prominent, important success outcomes for a company and an organization. That usually brings in like the notion of a business owner. And probably too often the business owner is probably separated from what's happening in technology land. And so one thing, like some of the things we like to stress from a process and practice perspective, if you're doing a post-incident review, right? There were decisions and things put in play beyond just the code base or the systems topology or the underlying dependencies. There are certain business assumptions that help influence decisions and choice points within the technology side of things. We like to advocate and almost mandate that if a technology team, name your manager up to director and maybe executive, are in that post-incident review, then the business counterparts come along and sit into incident review, and they start to understand because those action items that come out, it requires a conversation and discussion and decision around where you're going to go and reinvest to ideally not get bitten a second time by the same thing. It's pretty rare that those technology choices happen all by themselves. You got to weigh in the business. And I like to see business owners also, as being one myself at times, being accountable. Just like the technology side is accountable for the efficacy of the product offering and the experience to facilitate good outcomes, the business owner should also lean in and help complete the sentence.
Cool stuff. Any additional tip you wanna give to CTOs? Like we're slowly like moving to the end. That you wanna give to CTOs to be well prepared. Anything where you think like super beefy and super helpful helped you a lot?
I think having almost like a relentless pursuit to continuously improving, meaning like you're never done. It's easier said than done, but pushing your teams to get to that next stage can be those make or break points for you, right? And asking the hard questions around, like literally, don't assume anything. There's the whole thing about like if you assume too much, right? But diving in, providing agency for your own respective leaders to, again, be the mechanic and then be the driver to really drive for continuous improvement goes a long way, because too often we find ourselves collectively thinking about, okay, what do I need to do on an annual basis at the bare minimum to fit this compliance thing? That's not good enough at the end of the day, right? You really want to be asking the hard questions around these specific scenarios, almost like a separate kind of risk registry, if you will, from your overall like enterprise risk management program. But what is the risk profile of your software and systems for your products that and it's always you're gonna keep adding to it over time and have that as like a running ledger for you to be able to keep tackling and keep getting better at. Because again, we live in a world where we outsource dependencies. We got a lot of third-party things that we depend on that we don't really have direct control over. So you got to surround that in some specific manner with intent and purpose. And there's a tremendous ecosystem that you can tap into to help you do it. You don't have to do it all alone, but you got to have that conviction, that relentless pursuit at the end of the day.
So be diligent, huh?
Be diligent. Don't be lazy. Don't be lazy, and don't be satisfied. Be proud, but don't be satisfied. Keep it going, because we can always all keep doing better in this regard. It's not easy. It's not meant to be. It's continuous, like Kaizen, right? It's continuous improvement.
So I'm also not yet satisfied. I still have a little surprise question for you. So I don't know if you knew, but I had Alex Solomon, your co-founder, here on the podcast as well. Mm-hmm. And he, back in the days, like it's already a few years ago.
Yeah,
been a few years ago. So he told me about a little Easter egg in your core product that, I don't know, he himself built. Like back in the days, he used to code a lot, right? It's called, there's a hidden console, and then there's a hidden feature called the time machine that you just have to activate. You just have to know about it, and many people don't know. So do you? You first type. You open that console, and imagine we open that console now, and we first type in God, which reminds me of, I don't know, back in the days, like Quake or whatever it was. And then a time machine, and then Tim, and then May 2007. And that was an interesting time in your career. I don't know, you can explain, but because you've been owner of a yogurt bar back in the days. And please explain after my question. And now we're observing yourself for a while. And you now have the chance to whisper something into young Tim's ears. What would it be?
Wow. Yes. The thing I wish I knew back then, when my wife and I ventured on to start our own yogurt business, we were definitely at a certain inflection point in life as we just got married. My wife decided to leave corporate advertising and fell in love with baking. She became a certified French pastry chef at the culinary school in San Francisco. And we decided we should build a business. What are we going to do? And we looked at all kinds of business models and different ways to do it. And we decided that in San Francisco, there's a shortage of artisanal, organic, locally sourced desserts. And we settled on frozen yogurt as being our entry point into that. I was still working at a startup, so that was kind of like, paying the rent, so to speak. But in the evenings, I would go and close the store, clean up, mop up, and all that. It was quite humbling, but exciting all at the same time. One thing I wish we knew better, though, is I wish we hadn't underestimated how important it is to have, quite candidly, reserve capital and a backup plan in place. I think we were very successful in our first year. In 2007, when we opened, I believe it was the summer in San Francisco was unseasonably very warm. So perfect time to be selling frozen yogurt. And we did very, very well. And we parlayed that into a second location with ambitions to open multiple locations. Then in 2008, the economy started to go a little bit in the recessive environment. People stopped wanting to spend $3.50 on a perfect frozen yogurt that was organic and locally sourced from local farmers. But we didn't have much of a backup plan from a capital reserve perspective and or even an exit plan of any kind. So we learned a lot. We learned the hard way. Again, it's kind of an interesting example, literally, as I talk out loud here about not thinking about those failure scenarios ahead of time. And just the good times, and this is easy, this is great, we should do more of this. And it did bite us to some extent, but we learned a ton. It was experience I would never trade for anything else.
Yeah, can imagine. And sorry for me picking that spot in your CV, but I saw it and thought, well, okay, what was the guy doing and why?
It was awesome in so many ways, and then also just sobering in a lot of ways.
So thanks a lot for being very honest about that, and thanks for all the tips. Very helpful, Tim. Was really great having you on the podcast, and I hope we have the chance in the future again. I think folks out there should check out your ops guides, because I found them very helpful. I scanned through them and found them very helpful. Anything else that you want to shout out here?
No, I think just at the end of the day, especially as technologists, as technical leaders, we have to kind of own certain outcomes. And I think the notion of how you paint your paths and getting to being comfortable with your reliability, resiliency stance, and all that, it's not easy, but it's essential. It's in the new bucket of required, and our businesses depend on it. So the more we can learn together and do better, the better. And I'm always eager to learn more too.
You better be prepared, right? Don't be lazy. Thanks a lot, Tim. Have a great day.
Right, thanks, Toby. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the AlphaList podcast. If you liked this episode, share it with friends. I'm sure they love it too. Make sure to subscribe so you can hear deep insights into technical leadership and technology trends as they become available. Also, please tell us if there is a topic you would like to hear more about or a technical leader whose brain you would like us to pick. AlphaList is all about helping CTOs getting access to the insights they need to make the best decisions for their company. Please send us suggestions to cto@alphalist.com. Send me a message on LinkedIn or Twitter. After all, the more knowledge we bring to CTOs, the more growth we see in tech. Or, as we say on AlphaList, accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth. See you in the next episode.